Hey, everybody. My name is David, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Navia. So I'm here today to take you through a concept that I call process debt, and more importantly, the implications of process debt on such things as operational resilience, cybersecurity, AI governance, and more. So let's jump right in. So on one side of the equation, we have frameworks that define governance. And there's all kinds of different frameworks out there that help us secure our environment and set guidelines for operational resilience. We have cybersecurity frameworks such as the NIST cybersecurity framework or ISO 27001. We have very specific operational resilience frameworks such as DORA, which is the Digital Operational Resilience Act out of the UK, or ISO 22301, again, all focused on operational resilience. And we also have AI governance frameworks that are emerging, such as the NIST AI Risk Management Framework and the ISO 42001. So we have all kinds of frameworks out there, and there's many, many more, believe me, that really set guidelines for how an organization should operate and protect themselves, right? Protect themselves from a cybersecurity perspective, provide operational resilience, and govern AI. But with all these frameworks, failures still continue. There's many, many examples out there of people implementing changes that bring down production systems that have huge implications. We see it all the time with ransomware, with various breaches. So we have all this governance on one side, but why is it that failures keep continuing to happen? Well, let's talk a little bit about the difference between frameworks and processes. So frameworks really explain what you have to do and why you have to do it. So the NIST CSF, for example, is a cybersecurity framework. ISO 27001, again, focused on cybersecurity. ISO 42001, that's focused on AI. The Digital Operational Resilience Act out of the UK, COBIT. These things give a lot of guidance on what you should be doing and why you should be doing it. But you know what they're missing? They're missing the how to do it. That's where processes come in. Frameworks explain what and why, but it's processes that determine how. So things like incident management allows you to detect failures so you can basically recover. So if you have a security incident, the incident management process will effectively allow you to recover from that security incident. Change management can protect you by ensuring that all changes going into production have a security review. Problem management can get to the root cause of issues. Things like asset management, supplier management, and risk management, well, they help you identify the assets you need to protect, your suppliers, and the risk that they can potentially place onto your organization, and as well as the risk management process, which allows you to identify risk and come up with different ways to treat that risk, mitigate the risk, or actually resolve that risk. So there's a gap, right? As I said, we have these frameworks on one side of the equation that do a great job of explaining what it is we should do and why we need to do it. They really stress the importance. And we have processes on the other side of this gap that really is where work gets done, right? Work gets done every day in the processes that you execute in your organizations. But there's an execution gap. And that execution gap is the failure to operationalize the governance in the processes. Now, this is interesting. I've been in the process game for a long, long time. I've done many, many process design sessions, process assessments. And I remember on more than one occasion suggesting as a consultant that the GRC people be brought into the same room as the operations people who were designing the processes. And you wouldn't believe the pushback I get. No. We focus on audits, or they focus on audits. We focus on operation. The GRC people is low. We don't get involved in the details of running. We just set some guidelines. But wouldn't it be a lot better if the processes that were built actually support the governance that's in the frameworks? I call this process debt. That's and it comes about in two matters. This execution gap is the process debt. You have these processes on one side that have not been operationalized to support the various frameworks. And not only that, process debt also unfolds because the individual processes themselves, perhaps they're not owned, they're not governed, they're not consistently executed. So these processes start accumulating deficiencies. So let's define process debt. So process debt is the accumulation of deficiencies within an organization's process management system. Now, a process management system sits on top of the organization and it determines how processes interact with each other. It sets the guidelines for how all processes should be managed and operationalized. And many organizations actually don't have a process management system. They treat their processes as silos and they just let each department deal with their own processes. And and I'll get to that a little bit later, but that's an issue. So a process debt is that accumulation of deficiencies within an organization's process management system, and it's operational processes that increase operational cost, it reduces efficiency, it impedes change, and it really elevates governance, security, resilience, compliance, and business risk. Now, process debt is very analogous to technical debt. So many of you out there might be technical in nature. You know that, if you fail to update systems, if you have down-level frameworks in your development environment, if you haven't patched servers, if your technology is, out of support, that technical debt can really lead to a lot of operational issues. Well, process debt is analogous to that, except with process debt, it's how you operate your organization that's accumulating the debt. And this debt can accumulate gradually over time. So you have an incident management process that hasn't been reviewed in 5 years. Maybe it's not able to deal with new and emerging threats. It's not responsive enough to deal with security incidents, for example. And that debt is often invisible until a big crisis occurs. So you're working away and everything is fine, and you think all your processes are just humming along. Then all of a sudden, you had a system that did not have multi-factor authentication. A nefarious actor penetrates that system, manages to elevate their credentials, moves over to another system laterally, and basically sets some ransomware into place. And all of a sudden, you realize that these processes that you thought were working all along weren't really working. So a crisis occurs, and then what do? Not only can it also occur in the worst possible times when you're under severe crisis or threat, but process debt also impacts technology adoption. So you want to do a digital transformation. You want to automate a bunch of HR processes or a bunch of financial processes. Well, how do you automate what you don't understand? And if your processes aren't efficient in the first place, how do you make sure that those automation projects don't just automate bad processes so you do worse faster? You know what I mean? So there's a lot of things that can occur with process debt. It really can hit you when you least expect it and when you least need it to hit you. And it can also impact technology adoption over time. This is especially relevant as people are beginning to move fast and implement AI automation in their environments. So there are two types of process debt. So the first type is what I call systemic process debt. And that's part of the overarching process management system. In an organization, processes, well, if you look at an organization, it's really a set of processes all working. One process, for example, maybe a sales process feeds a forecasting process. The forecasting process feeds a manufacturing process. The manufacturing process goes into some logistical processes to get materials and produce. So if any one of those processes are broken, it's the interconnections between those processes, the end-to-end delivery of services, if you will, that are going to fail. And so many organizations do not look at their processes from an overall systems view. They don't have standards for processes. They let everyone implement their processes how they see fit. They don't have rules around process ownership, process governance, process execution, process automation. It's a free-for-all. So systemic process debt happens in that overarching system. And then you actually have operational process debt. That's in the individual processes. So a particular process is broken because it hasn't been looked at in a long time. It hasn't been adequately automated. You designed the process 5 years ago, but your ServiceNow implementation has drifted so far from that process that two aren't even connected. And if something were to happen, you don't have process documentation to go back and basically rationalize what's going on. So it's this enterprise-wide versus individual process. The debt can live in both areas, but together, that's process debt. So why do organizations accumulate process debt? Well, a weak process management system, as I just spoke about. There's no overarching rules as to how processes are governed or executed in an organization. Weak enterprise ownership. So there's no leadership at the top that says, hey, this is an important thing for us. Processes are important. We're going to follow the rules. So the system's not in place and the ownership isn't there. Processes being managed in silos. That's probably one of the biggest causes. Not only are processes often managed in silos, but the same process might be in multiple silos. So the incident management process for operations in terms of servers and network might be one, but the incident management process for security might be another. And people can logically argue that these are separate incident management processes, but in reality, if you want to get an enterprise view of what's going on, they should actually be connected together. So there should be one incident management process that can handle any kind of incident, as opposed to multiple incident management processes for different technologies or area of the organization. So processes are managed in silos, and every one of those processes has a different, basically is managed to a different level of efficiency and operation. Poor cross-process integration. So, the change management process isn't receiving the right inputs from incident management, or failures of the change aren't going back to incident or problem management. This poor process integration can result in downstream deficiencies, and not only in ITSM, service management processes, but also in business management processes. Another thing is that changes are outpacing process improvement. So the organization's moving ahead full steam, digital transformations, new AI initiatives, but these things, apologies, but these things are outpacing the organization's ability to make changes to the processes and keep the processes resilient enough to support these changes. And there's also limited continual improvement. A lot of people put a process in place and it's like set it and forget it. And there's no coming back to review if it's meeting its business outcomes. And I get it, man. We're all super busy. We're all just trying to solve the problem of the day. But you shouldn't look at process as a bureaucracy or the brakes. Processes can be your accelerator, because an efficient process, well managed, well operated, can make you do things more effectively, more efficiently. Too often, though, we've implemented processes as a way of providing bureaucracy, overhead, and basically guardrails, if you will, without thinking about how it should be in place to reduce friction and make things operate better, although in a safe, consistent way. So why does all this matter? Well, when you have a lot of process debt, it's going to reduce the agility of the organization. You're not going to be able to move as quick because, for example, if you're trying to implement a digital transformation or an AI initiative, you don't have the information you need. You don't understand your processes. Those processes may not be effective, and you try to pivot into a new direction, but you're unable to because of all of this process debt, all this weighty stuff that's sort of holding it back. It can also result in failed technology implementations. I've been involved in numerous, ServiceNow and other ITSM tool implementations that decided not to take a look at process, and took what I would call a lift and shift approach, where you're taking your old platform and just sort of reimagining it on new technology, thinking that will solve all your problems. And before long, you're back into the same boat, and you think you have to change your product again to correct the problems when all you really needed to do was focus on the process in the first place. There's also reduced operational resilience. If your processes aren't working well, for example, if your infrastructure management process has a patch policy, but your patches are lagging, the fact that you have a policy is great, but the fact that your patches are lagging opens you up to vulnerabilities. As a matter of fact, one study showed that 77% of organizations are behind in their patch management. So you're just opening yourself up. If you don't follow your processes in an effective way, it reduces resilience. It also affects governance and compliance. If you go back to the execution gap I was talking about, processes is where the governance actually lives on a day-to-day basis. So if you're not doing it where the work gets done, you're not governing anything. Governance doesn't live in risk registers and frameworks. It lives in the processes that you execute every day. and higher cybersecurity risks, right? If you're not implementing your processes correctly, if you don't have an asset management process, you don't know what assets you have. And if you don't know what assets you have, how can you protect them? That's just one example of how poor process management, how process debt can result in cybersecurity risks. And of course, inefficiencies bring about higher operating costs. AI really raises the stakes. AI, one of the main use cases for it is to automate processes. And AI, if you're automating a bad process, it will scale that execution in a bad way. So you're taking a bad process and using AI to basically supercharge it. And that will actually amplify the process debt because the AI will just do what it's basically will do what it's told, let's do what it's trained to do. And if you didn't train it on the right processes, for example, you have workarounds, you have integrations between processes that might not be clearly defined. Not, people will say to me, "Hey, David, we have all these process mining tools. I can go out and figure what would get done." Well, I'll tell you, in many organizations, you can't mine everything in the process. There's a lot of manual workarounds, there's transfers, there's of data, there's all sorts of things that happen in the background that the organization knows about, but it's not defined anywhere in the process or the workflow management systems. And then these process problems become enterprise problems. You're now taking these processes that were running, albeit maybe not so well, and implementing them at scale. So how do you go about reducing process debt? Well, first of all, you need to assess your process capability. You need to understand how effective your processes are today, both from a systemic perspective as well as an individual operational process perspective. You need to understand where those gaps are and then prioritize improvements. These improvements can be developed in a roadmap. It could be assigning ownership for a process, having more consistent execution, meaning every team follows the process. Maybe there's gaps in how people follow the process. Maybe there's some automation that can be improved within the process. So from the process gap analysis, you can prioritize your improvements. Implement those improvements and then reassess the capability on a regular ongoing basis. And this basically gives you a cycle of continual improvement. And if you're looking at both the systemic process debt as well as the operational process debt and looking at all your main processes, you can start reducing that process debt and better enabling yourself to deal with the fast pace of change that's going on, AI implementations, AI governance, digital transformations, et cetera. So some of the key takeaways from this brief talk: governance does not live in frameworks, nor does it live in risk registers. It doesn't live in checkboxes or GRC audits. Governance actually lives in the operational processes. Now, in many cases, it doesn't. But that's the gap, right? If you're not operationalizing governance in your processes, it doesn't matter what frameworks you say you adopt, you haven't really adopted them. Process debt prevents organizations from operationalizing their governance. And that's a key thing because the more process debt you have, the harder it is to take this governance and make it real in the organization. And if you do reduce process debt, you're going to improve your business outcomes. That could be faster implementations of technology, that can be more effective implementations of technology, that can be more efficiency, more resilience, more adherence to regulatory requirements. All of this can improve by reducing your process debt. So that was a brief talk on process debt. I'm going to be talking about this subject a lot. I'm very passionate about it. For more information about Navia and some of the ways that we can help with process debt, just go to navia.com and you can take a look at the resilience assessment platform, which is one of the tools we have to assess the process debt within your organization. So on that note, I want to thank you all for taking the time to look at this brief presentation, and I wish you a great day. Bye for now.